Council of Chalcedon in 451, and in particular after the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641, the need to demonstrate Coptic self-identity became more important than before. Usually one needs to stress his identity and define or form its features when one feels that his culture or ethnic existence is threatened, and the association with other groups of different ethnic or religious origin lead to the loss or distortion one's identity. Such feelings are to be found in particular among persecuted or ignored minorities. Coptic literature preferred to deal with the theme of identity in an indirect way. In Coptic and the Copto-Arabic writings, we find some hints and allusions that emphasize the superiority of Egypt and its church. These hints are not limited to post-Chalcedonian Coptic literature, but also found in pre-Chalcedonian texts, which were reworked or re-edited by interpolating passages to demonstrate Coptic identity, as we can see in the life of Patriarch Peter I. John of Shmun, that's Hermopolis Magna, now Ashmuni, is a special case regarding this theme. Very little is known about him. He was contemporary to Patriarch Damianus, as John himself mentioned. Before his consecration as Bishop of Shmun, he lived as a hermit, monk, and priest in the same province. The Arabic history of the patriarchs mentions John among the prominent bishops in the time of Damianus, without saying anything about his person. In addition, there is a papyrus found in Hermopolis Magna and dated to the 6th century. It contains a private letter in Greek and signed by Bishop John, who could be the same John under discussion. However, it doesn't provide any further information concerning his person. From the writings of John of Shmun, we have only two works. One panegyric on the Apostle Mark and another on Saint Anthony. Both were written when John was still a monk before his consecration as a bishop. It's not clear whether John wrote other works besides these two panegyrics. However, his choice of these two famous saints, Mark and Anthony, shows his tendency to emphasize the superiority of the Coptic Church. Unfortunately, the panegyric on Mark is fragmentary. However, the remaining text suffices to suggest how John of Shmun dealt with his theme. First of all, John demonstrates how Egypt before Mark lived in the darkness of paganism. He speaks very clearly about our worshippers of the vain idols in that time. He identifies the real history of Egypt with the coming of Mark, when he says, before Mark came, there was in Egypt no morning at all, but a continuous night. But when Mark the light came, the morning began. After that, John mentions the famous Egyptian monks like Pachomius, Bekyol, Shemud of Atriba, and others. These short citations from the panegyric on Mark by John of Shmun draw our attention to two important points: the Coptic view to the pre-Christian history of Egypt and the role of Saint Mark in the formation of the Coptic self-identity. Copts and the view toward the pre-Christian past. Although Copts descend from the ancient Egyptians and are considered their successors, we don't find any trace of this blood relationship in their Christian-oriented writings. The historical works of Copts don't mention the pharaohs within the list of the rulers of Egypt. despite some chapters in the Chronicle of John of Nicaea, in which he mentions some data concerning the history of Egypt, he doesn't mention them as his own ancestors. He sees Egypt before Christianity as a pagan land, which worshipped idols and demons. The first time that John relates himself to Egyptians is when he speaks about the prayers of our Egyptian fathers. He shows respect and pride of Egyptians when he speaks about the Holy Fathers, the Egyptian monks who were close with God. He relates himself only to Christian Egypt, the Egypt of martyrs, saints, and monks. The same attitude is to be found also in an undated homily preserved in Arabic and attributed to Theophilus of Alexandria. The anonymous author of this homily sees in Egypt before Christianity nothing but sinners and pagans. According to his view, the land of Egypt was full of impurity and a dwelling place for Satan. But after its Christianization, it became the place of God and his angels. Coptic historians were not interested in their own ancient Egyptian history, not only because they wanted to distance themselves from paganism, which pharaonic Egypt embodied, but also because they lacked the necessary information to be able to write about this era. It was a coincidence that Egypt changed its religion and its written script at the same time. In the 4th century, Christianity became the religion of the majority of Egyptians, and about the same period, or a little bit earlier, Coptic developed into a standard language with a markedly different grammar and orthography from its past. This fact was enough to cut off any connection with the past. Coptic historians were not able to read and understand the ancient Egyptian script and considered ancient Egyptian religion to be satanic worship. The new situation led the Copts to see themselves as descendants of the holy men of the Old Testament more so than as successors of the hidden pharaohs. A fragmentary homily which Shmun of Atriba preaching at an ancient Egyptian temple converted to a church makes Shmun's opinion of pharaonic temples clear. For him, it was a place for unclean spirits where the people sacrificed to and worshipped Satan. To clean and purify it, it had to be transformed into a church. His depiction and explanation of the hieroglyphic script on the temple's wall show his ignorance of the ancient Egyptian language and religion and his disgust of everything related to this pagan Egyptian past. It's true that some pre-Christian funerary customs and habits, such as mummification and caring for the body of the dead, survived in Christian Egypt, even in monastic and clerical circles. However, we cannot consider this continuity to reflect a survival of the belief upon which ancient Egyptians established their funerary rituals. The continuity of these practices was due to the perfect compatibility of Christian dogmas with ancient Egyptian religion concerning the resurrection of the body. Coptic identity was based primarily on Christian fundamentals. Coptic Christians rejected the glories of the pre-Christian Egypt and did not seek national identity. They did not understand Christianity as a national movement, but rather a way of life and thinking. Due to Christianity, Copts created an indigenous sense of identity. They became adherents and members of a culture and could challenge that could challenge Greek that mean pagan philosophy. With the passage of time, this feeling of cultural superiority increased, particularly after the Arab conquest, as Copts believed that Muslim conquerors had no culture to offer and their Arabic language was not worthy to speak. As we can see in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Samuel of Kalamun, Copts found no point of resemblance between the Coptic language of the saints and the Arabic language of the Bedouin. Despite the disappearance of any positive connection between Christian and Pharaonic Egypt in literary sources, and particularly in historiographical writings, Coptic art offers enough evidence for such a connection. Copts adopted some ancient Egyptian elements into their art after Christianizing them. Some ancient Egyptian elements and motifs survived in Coptic art and show, without any doubt, the continuity of ancient Egyptian art in the early Coptic period. Saint Mark and Coptic identity. The Apostle Mark is not only the preacher of Christianity in Alexandria and the first martyr in Egypt, but he also became a symbol of legitimacy for every Coptic patriarch who is first of all considered the successor of Saint Mark. It's true that the struggle for the primacy among the great patriarchates, that means Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople, began in the 4th century. However, after the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and after the establishing of the Melkite Church, the need to stress the relationship between the Coptic patriarchs and the memory of Saint Mark became more important than before to confront those who put the legitimacy of the Coptic patriarchs in question. From that time on, the Coptic Church had to prove the correctness of its faith before the Christian world, but also had to defend the legitimacy of its patriarchs and hence its existence. During this struggle, the memory of Saint Mark played a considerable role. Coptic and Copto-Arabic sources offer some hints that refer to the interest of Coptic historians to demonstrate the role of Saint Mark in the process of establishing and forming the Coptic identity. The martyrdom of Patriarch Peter I offer an interesting passage in which Peter prays at the tomb of Saint Mark before his martyr death. In his prayer, Peter follows the succession of the Alexandrian Patriarchate in order to assert the apostolic origin of the Alexandrian Church and the legitimacy of the patriarchs. The prayer of Peter of Alexandria at the tomb of Saint Mark serves only to demonstrate the untroubled continuity between Mark and Peter of Alexandria and to assert the foundation of the Coptic Church by Mark. Although this visit of Peter to the tomb of Saint Mark may not have a historical basis, it later found a high popularity among the Copts by its inclusion in the Arabic history of the patriarchs. Although it's not clear when exactly the martyrdom of Peter has been expanded, it can be assumed that the additional parts had been interpolated in the 5th century after 451, since other post-Chalcedonian Coptic sources have the same tendency, as we will see. A very similar passage is to be found in the so-called Life of Dioscorus. On the ship from Alexandria to Constantinople to attend the Council of Chalcedon, Dioscorus prayed to God and mentioned his predecessors from Mark to Cyril. The life of Dioscorus doesn't cease to accent and highlight this close relationship between Saint Mark and Dioscorus as his legal successor. The usage of the memory and the figure of Saint Mark in the formation of the Coptic identity is not limited to Coptic literature, but extends also to Coptic art. In an early 7th century ivory relief, we see Saint Mark seated on a throne and holding his gospel. He is surrounded by his immediate 35 successors, the patriarchs of Alexandria from Anianus to Anastasius in the 7th century. In the background, we see the city of Alexandria. This relief comes from Alexandria and is preserved now in the Musée du Louvre in Paris. Here, the stress on the apostolic origin of the Coptic Church and the legitimacy of its patriarchs is explicitly and not implicitly as in the written texts. In the period from the second half of the 5th century to the 7th century, the need to present self-identity among Copts increased to face the power and authority of the Melkite Church that enjoyed the financial and military support of the Byzantine state. Literature and art were instruments to keep the memory of Saint Mark alive among Coptic believers. However, there was another more important way to keep his memory immortal, namely the relics of Saint Mark himself. With the passage of time, the veneration of the head of Saint Mark became an important part in the consecration of the new patriarch. On the next day of his consecration, according to Ibn Sabbah, the patriarch should visit the head of the apostle, where it's preserved, and bow before it. After that, he prayed with incense and read the beginning of the Gospel of Saint Mark. After the prayer, he exchanged the old covering of the head with a new one, took it in his arms, and let the assembled people kiss it. Ibn Sabbah ends his chapter with the following important phrase, and he says, with this ceremony, his consecration as a patriarch is completed, because he is the one who sits on the throne of the Apostle Mark. John of Shmun and Egypt. In his panegyric on Saint Anthony, John of Shmun used the opportunity to praise Egypt as a holy land that bore saints and where prophets lived or buried. He says, Anthony was Egyptian by origin. Where will the sun rise except in the east? And where do you wish Anthony to shine forth except in Egypt? For most of the saints who have lived have been from Egypt, or Egypt has attracted them from other places. After that, John mentions some prophets of the Old Testament who visited Egypt or were buried there, like Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. Then John returns to remind us that the famous monastic leaders were Egyptian. He says, in the same way, the leaders of all the monks practiced ascetic discipline in Egypt. The land of Egypt is fertile not only for growing fruits that perish, but also for people who bear fruit according to God. Other lands bring different kinds of fruit to us, and we find enjoyment in them. But our pride is in our own fruit, in particular in what belonged to us and in what existed here, the likes of which are not elsewhere. For it said concerning papyrus or paper that it's made only in Egypt and does not grow in other countries. In the same way, Anthony lived in this country, and there is no other Anthony like him. Here it's clear how proud of Egypt John was. Other literary sources tell us the same about Anthony and ennoble him over all other monks, since he symbolizes Egyptian monasticism. Shmun of Atrib believed that even if all the monks of this time came together in a single place, they would not make a single company. These and other writings are quoted by John of Shmun in his panegyric. The life of Dioscorus also attests that only the bishops of Egypt can endure pains and punishment for the belief. The author of this life says to the Chalcedonian bishop of Gangara, "Who but he could endure what you do against my father? I attest before you that there is no other bishop equal to him except only in Egypt." As we see, John of Shmun is not the only Coptic author who is interested in praising and ennobling his land Egypt, but he may be the only known author who expressed this tendency explicitly in his works. Other Coptic authors refer to their pride of their homeland and of their Coptic church implicitly, using key figures. However, the figure of Saint Mark remains by far the most used and effective figure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important contribution. Questions, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting contribution, of course, which contains touches upon several themes that can be discussed. I think you very correctly stress the negative image that you find in Coptic literature of, say, pharaonic Egypt. That is obvious. But of course, there is one positive exception that shows a positive interest in pre-Christian Egypt. That is the novel about the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses. That's, I think, in my opinion, that is really an exception in this case. But unfortunately, situate this against the background of the Arab conquest or something like that. But I think you might have mentioned it.
Yeah, as you see, it's an exception.
Yeah, of course, it is exceptional.
Yeah.
No, you're quite right. You're quite right in stressing this. But this was just recommend to your attention.
I have just two.
Excuse me, you have other.
No.
Okay.
Just I have two remarks. One is from a letter of Sever of Antioch, who was more or less contemporary. He died in 338, and he's talking about the Alexandrian people, saying that the Alexandrian people think that if the sun rises, it's for them, and if the light turns, it's always towards them. And I believe that more or less this attitude is explained by your talk. Another thing is a text recent 1,000 years between this text and what you mentioned is the text of John of Asur, Confrantut, and Abutik, and the region of the where we find in the homily praising Severus also a long praising of all, comparing the mountain of Asur and the mountain of Antioch, and say if the mountain of Asur provide saints like Saint Claude, Apatir, etc., the mountain of Asur is also prized that it took all these saints and they are buried there. And Severus of Antioch, who was from Antioch, always he has this comparison between Antioch and Asur, and always Asur is better than Antioch. So it's just two examples with a distance of 1,000 years only. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know this letter of Severus, but thank you for this.
Yes, please. You have a question.
Do have another question. It is really a question. How do you date this martyrdom of St. Peter? Because I think I understand well that you propose a very late date for that.
Yeah, we have more than one version of this martyrdom, and some later versions are expanded. And this scene with Peter at the tomb of Saint Mark are not to be found in all versions.
It's not in all versions.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was really.
Yes, please.
Yes, I would like to note that there is a literary background to the praise of St. Mark and St. Anthony, because John of Shmun is using the form of the encomium. And one of the practically required topoi of the encomium is praise of the native land of the person. In the case of Mark, Egypt has become, in effect, his native land. So praise of Egypt is necessary as part of the encomium. The same is true of St. Anthony. In the case of St. Mark, he is also playing on the word for Egypt, Cayman.
Thank you. Any more questions? Any more questions? No more questions. Thank you very much. So I would like to invite Shireen Sadek